Hey friends, welcome back to Lost Scrolls Archive. Before the Archons started farming human souls, somebody had to teach them how. That part of the story almost nobody tells you. The Archons did not invent the prison. They inherited it. There was an older crew that came first. They came down before the soul recycling system was finished. They came down before the Demiurge had fully consolidated his hold on this domain. They came down with a specific assignment, and they completed that assignment, and then they handed the operation over. The Book of Enoch named them. The Hebrew tradition called them Watchers. The Gnostics, when they got their hands on the same memory, recognized exactly who these beings were, and added details that the Inkian material was forced to leave out. And once you put the two traditions side by side, the prehistory of your imprisonment becomes visible, not as a myth. As for infrastructure history, 200 of them came down. That is the number Enoch gives. 200 watchers organized in groups of 10, each group with its own commander. The whole operation under a single supreme commander, whose name the Book of Enoch preserves as Semjaza or Shemiaza, with variations depending on translation. They descended onto a mountain. The mountain is named Mount Hermon, and the timing is given as the days of Jared, which in the Dorkian chronology places this event roughly 7 generations before the flood. They made a pact with each other before they descended, because they knew what they were about to do was a violation of the higher order. They swore an oath that they would all do it together, so that no one of them could later claim he had not consented. That oath itself is the first piece of Watcher technology. The principle that mutual implication binds a group together is something they brought with them. Every secret society on Earth since then has run on that exact same principle. The blood oath, the shared crime, the mutual hostage. That is Watcher operating logic. The fact that the oath happened on a mountain matters too. Elevation is significant in this whole architecture. The Watchers did not descend casually onto flat land. They picked a high point. The high point is the threshold between their plane of origin and the lower plane they were entering. Every later mythology that places gods on mountaintops, Olympus, Sinai, Miu, is a memory of this initial threshold crossing protocol. The Watchers established the template, and the template has been repeated across every civilization since. When you read about a god descending onto a mountain anywhere in any tradition, you are reading a derivative of the Watcher descent. The pattern propagated. It became a cultural memory. It became architecture. They took human wives. The Book of Enoch is explicit about this. The Watchers came down. They saw the daughters of men. They descended, and they fathered children with them. Those children were the Nephilim, giants on the earth, hybrid beings. The text described them as enormous, as devouring, as ravenous, as so destructive that the earth itself eventually cried out against them. That is the standard reading. That is what you get if you stay inside the Inkian text without going further. Watchers descend. Watchers take wives. Watchers produce monsters. Monsters destroy the world. God sends the flood to cleanse. End of story. Almost every popular saying stops there. Almost every YouTube video about the Watchers stops there. And almost every reader is left thinking that the Watchers were essentially a romantic crime, a group of cosmic beings who could not resist human women, and whose lust unleashed catastrophe. As if this whole thing was an affair that got out of hand. That reading is comfortable. It is wrong. The Gnostic texts, when you bring them in, show you what was actually happening. Look at the apocalypse of Adam. Look at the reality of the rulers. Look at the cross-references buried inside the Apocryphon of John. These texts describe the same beings in the same descent, but the Gnostic angle is unflinching. The Watchers did not come down because they were horny. They did not come down because they were rebellious angels acting out against the true God. They came down because they were recurred. They came down on assignment. They came down with a deliverable. And the deliverable was not children. The deliverable was a curriculum. This is where the Enochian tradition and the Gnostic tradition diverge sharply. In the Enochian reading, the Watchers go rogue. They violate the order. They are punished. In the Gnostic reading, there is no rogue. The Watchers were sent down by the Demiurge, who at that point in the timeline was still building his system. The demiurge needed a workforce to prepare humanity for harvest. He himself, being malformed and limited, was not capable of the precision work required. So he commissioned the Watchers, beings of higher order than himself, but corrupted into his service, beings who could descend into matter without losing all of their capacities. Beings who could teach the human wives, the Nephilim. Those were not the mission. Those were the side effects. Those were what happens when you put higher order beings into prolonged contact with matter. They begin to interact with matter in ways that produce hybrid offspring. The hybrids were the cover story. The wives were not the goal. The goal was the curriculum. Here is something the standard accounts almost never mention. The Nephilim, produced by the Watcher human unions, are not in the Gnostic technical reading just oversized humans with appetite problems. They are something more specific. They are hybrid carriers of Watcher data. Their bodies contain partial Watcher capacities, partial perceptual range, partial energetic substrate, partial access to the higher planes the Watchers came from. The Nephilim were walking distribution nodes. They carried the Watcher curriculum in their very biology, and through them the curriculum penetrated deeper into the human gene pool than any teaching could have done on its own. When the Nephilim ate, fought, married, and propagated, they propagated Watcher substrate. The flood, when it came, was not just about cleansing wickedness. It was a specific attempt to scrub Nephilim biology out of the human stock. Whether that scrub succeeded is another matter. The Gnostic position is that it did not fully succeed. Traces of Nephilim biology remain in certain lineages. This is part of why some humans appear more naturally Archon susceptible than others, and that brings us to what they actually taught. The Book of Enoch lists the forbidden arts in a specific catalogue. Different translations give different counts, but there is a core set that every version preserves. We are going to look at five forbidden arts that the Watchers transmitted to humanity, and what each one was actually for. First, metallurgy, the working of metals, the making of swords, knives, spears, armor. The Book of Enoch says, the Watcher, Azel, taught humanity how to make weapons of war. The standard reading is that this introduced violence. Humans had been peaceful, and the Watchers introduced the technology of killing. But look at what metallurgy does at a deeper level. It allows the conversion of raw material into instruments of will. It allows a being who holds a tool to extend his power beyond his body. It allows hierarchy to be enforced. Before metallurgy, no small group can hold a large group against its consent for very long. After metally, 20 armed men can hold 1,000 unarmed men indefinitely. Metallurgy is the precondition of organized human domination. It is not a side effect of violence. It is the technology of concentration of power, and concentration of power is the precondition of every Archon-aligned political structure that has existed since kingship empire, the state. None of it functions without metallurgy. The Watchers did not give humans swords because they were warlike. They gave humans swords because the demiurge's harvest system required a stratified human society, and a stratified society requires coercion, technology, and metallurgy is the bedrock. Coercion technology. The first forbidden art is the installation of hierarchy. Notice also what metallurgy does to the metallurgist himself. The metal worker stands at the forge, heats raw ore, he hammers it, he shapes it, he produces a tool that exceeds his own body in lethality. In the act of producing it, he establishes a particular relationship to matter, one of imposed form. The metal worker treats matter as something to be mastered. This relationship to matter then propagates outward through the entire culture that uses metal tools. Everyone who handles a metal tool absorbs at some level the imposed form relationship. Matter becomes raw material. Other beings become potential raw material. The metallurgical mind cannot help but extend its own operating principle outward. Slavery in the strict sense requires metal. You cannot hold slaves without iron. The first slaves on earth were held by the first metallurgists. The two technologies are inseparable. Second, cosmetics. The Book of Enoch is specific about this one, and most readers find it strange. Why would cosmetics be on the list of dangerous teachings? eye paint, dyes, jewelry, the arts of beautification. Enoch says the watcher Azil taught these to women. The standard reading is that this introduced vanity, sexual temptation, and the corruption of natural beauty. Look deeper. Cosmetics are not really about beauty. Cosmetics are about the deception of appearance. They are about teaching a being to present a face that is not its own. They are about training the consciousness to operate behind a mask. And once you have taught a population to present false faces to each other as a matter of routine, you have installed the substrate for every later form of social deception. Diplomacy, performance, public relations, the corporate persona, the political smile. The deepest layer here is even darker. Cosmetics train humans to be comfortable with masked perception. Generally, once a culture accepts that the face it sees is not necessarily the face that is, the culture loses its instinctive ability to detect non-human presences wearing human masks. The Archons themselves operate primarily through impersonation. They wear borrowed faces. The cosmetic art was the first training step that taught humans not to look too closely at faces, not to ask whether the face matches the being behind it. Cosmetics are an Archon defense technology disguised as adornment. Think about what this means for the modern moment. We live in the most cosmetic civilization in human history. Filters, Photoshop, surgical alteration, the entire economy of presented selves. By the Gnostic measure, this is not a recent development. It is the maturation of a watcher technology that has been running for thousands of years. The H-cosmetic capacity has been developing and elaborating since Azil first painted the eyes of the first human woman. Every century has added new layers. The current moment where most humans interact through curated digital faces, and where physical appearance can be edited at will, is what the original installation was always pointing toward. The face that you see online is a watcher substrate face. The face that you present online is also a watcher substrate face. The entire substrate is the technology that the watchers introduced, now operating at industrial scale. Third, astrology. The watcher Baracel, according to Enoch, taught humans the reading of the stars. This sounds the most innocent of the five to a modern ear. It sounds like the origin of a hobby. It is not. Astrology in its watcher-transmitted form was not the modern decorative practice. It was a system of false determinism. The watchers taught humanity that the stars and planets govern human fate. They taught that your birth moment fixes your destiny. They taught that the heavenly bodies are causal agents in your life. And once a population believes this, the population voluntarily surrenders its sovereignty to a system of celestial mechanics that the demiurge controls. Ka is the technical claim. The 7 planetary spheres that astrology has always centered on, Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, correspond directly to the 7 Archon authorities named in the Apocryphon of John. Each Archon governs one sphere. When a human consults astrology and orients his life by the position of a planet, he is consenting to be governed by the Archon assigned to that planet. The consultation is the consent ritual. Astrology is not a description of how the heavens influence you. It is a constant extraction mechanism that gets you to voluntarily place yourself under specific Archon governance by reading your horoscope. The Watchers did not introduce humans to the stars. Humans have always known the stars. What the Watchers introduced was the framing that the stars are causal agents to whom you submit. That framing is the installation. Once installed, the entire population could be governed by adjusting the planetary symbolism, and humans would experience the governance as their own destiny. And here is the cleverness of the design. The astrological framing is partially to RU. The Archons do operate through the planetary spheres, so when a person studies astrology and finds that the predictions parley work, finds that the planetary positions do correlate with experiences, the person concludes that astrology is a valid system, when what is actually happening is that the person, by studying and applying astrology, has activated a real consent channel to real Archon governance. The system works precisely because consenting to it creates the channel through which it then operates. It is a self-fulfilling installation. The more you study astrology, the more astrology applies to your life, because each act of study is a renewal of consent. The Gnostic counterposition is not that the planets are meaningless, it is that the planets in the form encountered through the Watcher, installed astrological, framing, are channels for Archon governance, and that a sovereign pluromic-aligned soul does not orient by them. The Aeons do not live on the planets. The pluromic transmission does not arrive through the celestial spheres. To consult a horoscope is to look in exactly the wrong direction for guidance. Fourth incantation. The Book of Enoch is careful about this one because it sits closest to the heart of the Watcher. Operation. The Watcher Castasia taught humanity the casting of spells, the binding and loosing of spirits, the technology of magical commands. Enoch frames this as the corrupting introduction of dark magic. What it actually is, in Gnostic technical terms, is the installation of Archon language, interface protocols. Spells are not random words. Spells are particular vocal mental configurations that establish communication channels with specific non-human entities. The Watchers taught humans the syntax of the Archon language. Once that syntax is loose in a culture, humans begin contacting Archons constantly, even when they don't intend to. Every formal prayer of address, every invocation, every solemn declaration in the wrong frequency is a Watcher syntax operation. This is why the Gnostics warn so sharply against ritual prayer in any form not specifically pluromic. The Orthodox Christian assumes prayer is universally good. The Gnostic position is the opposite. Prayer in the wrong syntax is a phone line directly to the demiurge. The form of the prayer matters more than the content. A heartfelt prayer in Watcher syntax delivers luch to an Archon regardless of who the prayer was consciously addressed to. This is also why Gnostic counterpractices use a completely different linguistic structure. The pluromic recognition prayers do not look like spells. They do not have the formal incantation shape. They do not invoke. They deke. The shape of the pluromic address is different from the shape of the Watcher address, and the difference is precisely what determines who receives the transmission. Look at the incantation structure carefully. Every incantation has three components: a numbing of the entity being addressed, a command or request aimed at that entity, a sealing phrase that closes the communication. This three-part structure is the Watcher template. You see it in every magical tradition that descends from the original installation. You see it in formal religious prayer. You see it in legal oaths. You see it in corporate ritual statements. The three-part structure is so embedded in human communication that most humans cannot even notice it as a structure. It just looks like how solemn speech works. But it is not how solemn speech works in itself. It is how Watcher syntax, solemn speech, works. The structure was installed. The pluromic alternative does not use the three-part structure. The pluromic recognition event does not name, command, and seal. It recognizes, opens, and remains open. It does not address an entity that is elsewhere. It establishes co-presence with an entity that is already here. There is no incantation, there is only acknowledgement. This is why so many Gnostic prayer fragments in the surviving texts read strangely to modern eyes. They do not have the rhetorical shape we expect from formal prayer. They sound more like statements of recognition than like petitions. That is because they are statements of recognition. They operate in a completely different linguistic register than the Watcher syntax address. Gritting. This is the one most modern viewers will resist hardest, and it is the most important of the five. The Watchers taught humanity the technology of writing, the binding of memory to external storage. Before writing, human memory was held internally. A person was identical with what that person could remember. The continuity of identity was the continuity of the live memory inside the live body. Knowledge was transmitted person to person, voice to ear, embodied teacher to embodied student. The transmission carried context, presence, breath, energy. After writing, memory was offloaded. Knowledge began to live on tablets, scrolls, parchments, books. And here is the technical claim the Gnostics make about this. External memory storage does not just extend human memory. It replaces a part of human memory. Once a culture relies on writing, the parts of the brain and the parts of the soul that previously held that memory begin to atrophy. Specifically, the soul functions that store pleuromic recognition memory. The memories of pre-birth, of the pleroma of the upper aeons, get crowded out by the habits of external storage. The Gnostic claim is even sharper than that. The Watchers gave humans writing precisely because writing weakens the soul circuit that retains pleuromic memory. A culture that writes is a culture that gradually forgets. It came from somewhere higher. A culture that does not write retains in its oral tradition the resonance of its origin. The literate civilization is the Eware's civilization, and every other forbidden art, the watch, is taught, becomes more effective in a literate population, because the literate population has weakened its native discernment. This is why the most ancient Gnostic transmissions insisted on oral teaching first, written transmission second. Writing was used because the Roman persecution made oral transmission impossible. But the Gnostics knew that writing itself was a watcher technology, and they wrote with full awareness of operating inside the enemy's medium. There is a second-order effect here that the Gnostic texts hint at, but rarely state directly. Writing also creates the illusion of fixity in transmitted teachings. Once a teaching is written down, it appears stable. Generations of students approach the same text. They believe they are receiving the same teaching their predecessors received, but the teaching is dead on the page. Living teaching exists only in the transmission moment between conscious soul and conscious soul. The page is a record of a transmission, not the transmission itself. A culture that relies on written transmission gradually loses the capacity to distinguish a living teaching from a dead record of one. Everyone reads the same words. Nobody experiences the same recognition. The transmission has been buried inside the medium that supposedly preserves it. This is why every authentic Gnostic teacher across history has insisted that the written texts must be encountered together with a living transmission. The text alone is insufficient. The text is a doorway, not a teaching. The teaching arrives if it arrives in the moment a student encounters the text in the presence of a teacher whose recognition is alive. Without that presence, the words remain shapes on a page, and the reader produces opinions about them, but the recognition does not transmit. The Gnostic teacher functions as the missing component in a writing-dependent civilization. The teacher restores the live channel that writing alone cannot carry. So that is the 5-art curriculum: metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, incantation, writing, hierarchy, deception, false determinism, Archon language interface, and the offloading of soul memory. Together, they form a complete operating system for a domesticated human population. Each one reinforces the others. Each one creates dependencies that make the next one easier to install. Each one on its own looks like a gift or a neutral technology. Together, they are infrastructure. There is a question I want to put in front of you before we go any further, because it sharpens everything that follows. If the Watchers were sent on assignment by the Demiurge, and if the Demiurge himself is a malformed being who emerged from Sophia's first solo emanation, then where do the Watchers themselves come from? Are they native to the demiurgic system, or were they recruited from somewhere higher? The Gnostic texts give a partial answer to this, and the answer is uncomfortable. The Watchers were not originally demiurgic. They originated as beings of an order somewhere between the pleuromic aeons and the lower, demiurgic structures. They are, in the technical sense, intermediate beings. They have access to upper transmission, but they also have access to lower substrate. They are bilingual in a way that neither pure aeons nor pure archons are, and that is precisely why they were so useful to the Demiurge. He needed beings who could translate his crude directives into installations that would actually work on a pleuromic spark-carrying species. The pure archons could not have built the human curriculum because they could not perceive the pleiomic substrate well enough to install effective coverings over it. The Watchers could. This means the Watchers are in some sense fallen, not fallen in the moralized sense of having rebelled, fallen in the technical sense of having descended from a higher possibility into a lower function. They were once closer to the pleioma than they are now. They retained capacities from their higher origin while taking on the demiurgic assignment. The capacities are what made them dangerous. A pure Archon could never have written the book of Enoch's curriculum. The curriculum required a being who knew intimately what pleiomic transmission looks like, because only such a being could design specific countermeasures to it. The Watchers were spies in a sense. They were pleromic adjacent enough to know the target, and demiuric aligned enough to attack. The Book of Enoch hints at this when it describes the despair that fell on the Watchers after they completed their work. They knew what they had done. Some of them attempted to repent. Enoch himself is dispatched by the higher realms to inform them that their fate is sealed, and that no intercession on their behalf will be heard. This is striking when you read it carefully. The Watchers are not portrayed as triumphant evildoers. They are portrayed as beings caught in a fate they themselves came to regret. The oath they took at the start of the operation bound them to its completion, even when individual Watchers began to see what the operation actually was. The Gnostic angle adds depth here. The Watcher regret is real. It is also irrelevant to the operation. The installation, once completed, runs whether or not the installers regret it. The 5 forbidden arts function as soul trap technologies regardless of the emotional state of the beings who introduced them. The infrastructure does not care about its installers' feelings. It just runs, and the Watchers, having installed it, became bound to it, chained to the very apparatus they built. This is the deeper meaning of the Enochian language about Watchers being chained in darkness. They are not in a literal dungeon. They are tied to the running of the infrastructure they brought into existence. They cannot leave it. The operation is their fate. And here is where, if you have followed Gnostic content elsewhere, you might think you have the picture. The Watchers corrupted humanity. They introduced the technologies of soul trap. They are the villains of the pre-Archon era. The Book of Enoch confirms it. The Gnostic texts deepen it. The prehistory of the prison is now clear. That is where most teachings stop. That is where you should not stop, because the Watchers did not corrupt humanity. That framing itself is a misdirection. Corruption implies that there was a pure human population, untouched, original, that the Watchers then damaged. The deeper Gnostic reading says no such pure population existed. The human stock the Watchers found was already an experimental construction of the demiurge, a body designed to hold a pleiomic spark in conditions of forgetting. The Watchers did not corrupt the original humans. They completed the construction. Let me say that more directly. Civilization itself, as you have ever known it, is Watcher technology. Not just the dark parts. Not just the obviously coercive parts. All of it. Agriculture, kingship, organized religion, law codes, money, timekeeping, navigation, mathematics. All of these have their root in the Watcher transmissions. And all of these were designed not as gifts, but as installations. The Archons did not create the human prison. They walked into a human prison that the Watchers had already finished building, and they took over the running of it. The Archons inherited a customer base that was already trained. That is the precise position. By the time the Archon overseen soul harvest system was fully operational, humans were already domesticated, hierarchical, literate, time-bound, astrologically pacified, weaponized against each other, and psychologically masked. The Archons did not need to do any of the heavy lifting of population conditioning. The Watchers had done it. The Archons just took the controls. This is why so much of what the Gnostics warned against is not violent. It is ordinary. The Gnostics warned against the calendar. They warned against the marketplace. They warned against the temple. They warned against the king. They warned against the law court. Not because these things are evil in some moralistic sense, but because each of these is a Watcher installation operating in plain sight. The Gnostic insight is that the prison is not visible because the prison is the room you have always been standing in. The prison is the furniture. The prison is what you have always called the world. Now think about what this means for you. Right now you are reading this, or you are listening to this and reading along. Either way, you are using writing. You are using the most foundational of the Watcher technologies. You are using it to receive a Gnostic teaching. There is something almost paradoxical about that, and the Gnostics knew it. The Apocryphon of John was written. The Gospel of Truth was written. The Apocalypse of Adam was written. The Gnostic teachers used the Watcher's own medium to transmit the counter-information. They had no choice. The oral lineage had been hunted. But look around your daily life and watch how many Watcher technologies you are operating, moment by moment. You wake up to a clock. That is timekeeping, descended from astrology, descended from the Watchers. You look in a mirror. That is the cosmetic apparatus, the technology of presenting a face. You check your horoscope or your weather forecast or your daily prediction in any form. That is astrology in its modern descendants. You read messages on a screen. That is writing. You handle money. That is metallology at its abstract endpoint. You speak corporate or social ritualized language. That is an incantation in its decayed form. None of this is neutral. None of this is just convenience. Every one of these acts is a tiny consent renewal to the operating system that the Watchers installed. And every consent renewal narrows your perceptual bandwidth slightly more. The narrowing is so gradual you do not feel it, but it is constant. When you take a pill, you are participating in a chain that runs from modern pharmacy through alchemy, through the Watcher, taught her craft, that Enoch lists, alongside the other forbidden arts. When you fire a weapon, even at a target on a range, you are completing the circuit that began with Azil teaching the first sword. When you sign your name on a contract, you are activating the Watcher writing binding that lets external storage hold a piece of your will. None of these are dramatic. All of them are real, and the Archons are still here, sitting on top of all of it. The Watcher installation is still running. The Archons inherited an operating system, and that operating system is what you call your daily life. This is the moment in a Gnostic teaching where you start to wonder whether anything is escapable. If everything is Watcher infrastructure, if civilization itself is the prison, what hope is there? You cannot stop using writing. You cannot stop using the clock. You cannot exit the metallurgical economy. Even rejection of civilization movements use written manifestos and wear metal belt buckles. The infrastructure is total. Here is the Gnostic answer to that question, and this is the part that the popular Watcher content channels almost never reach. The Gnostics teach that there was, and is, a parallel transmission, a counter-curriculum, that the Watchers could not interfere with, because it does not run on the same substrate as their installation. The Watchers installed an operating system that runs on words, symbols, numbers, time markers, hierarchies, and external memory. All of those are mediated substrates. They require an intermediary structure to function. A word is not a thing. It is a token that refers. A number is not a thing. It is a marker. A symbol is not a thing. It is a stand-in. The entire Watcher operating system runs on the principle that the medium stands between the perceiver and the perceived. The parallel pleromic transmission does not run on tokens. It runs on direct recognition. It does not require words, symbols, numbers, or any external substrate. It transmits soul to soul, aeon to spark, pleoma to pneumatic recognition. The Watchers could not interfere with this transmission because they were never given the keys to it. The Demiurge himself does not possess the keys to it. The keys remain with the upper aeons and with Sophia, and these beings broadcast continuously on a frequency that the Watcher installation cannot detect. This is why Gnostic practice is what it is. Notice that the core Gnostic practices, the ones that actually deliver soul recognition, are almost all non-mediated. The silence practice. Silence is not a token. The recognition prayer. Recognition is not a symbol. The breath spark activation. Breath is not a sign. The bridal chamber. The encounter is not a ritual, but a meeting, a pleromic name speaking. The name is not a word in the ordinary sense, but a frequency that the soul produces. Every authentic Gnostic practice is designed to step out of the Watcher operating system, temporarily, and into the pleromic transmission stream that runs underneath. The Watchers cannot follow you there. The Archons cannot follow you there. The Demiurge cannot follow you there. The infrastructure is total in its own domain, but the pleromic transmission is UTAD domain entirely. This is the discovery that changes everything for a Gnostic. The prison is total only if the prison is the only operating reality. The moment you make conscious contact with the parallel transmission, even briefly you realize that the prison is overlaid on something larger. The infrastructure is real, but it is not foundational. Underneath it is the actual ground. And once you have made contact, even for a single instant, the infrastructure can never trap you completely again. You will continue to use writing. You will continue to use the clock. You will continue to operate within civilization. But internally, you will know that none of this is the substrate. You will know that the substrate is the pleuromic transmission, and that you have access to it. The watch has installed the operating system, and the operating system is still running. But your awareness no longer lives exclusively inside it. Your awareness can step out at will. This is why the Gnostics did not in general advocate for tearing down civilization. They did not preach revolution against the empire. They did not call for the abolition of cities or laws or markets. They knew that the infrastructure was too pervasive to attack frontally, and they also knew that attacking it frontally would be unnecessary. The infrastructure cannot hold a soul that has accessed the parallel transmission. The infrastructure only holds souls that have no other operating reference. Give a soul a parallel reference, even a small one, and the infrastructure becomes a costume rather than a cage. This is also why the Gnostic was so often mistaken for a worldly, ordinary, well-adapted person. The Gnostic continued to work, marry, raise children, pay taxes, participate in the visible economy. The transformation was not visible from outside. The transformation was internal. The Gnostic walked through the Watcher infrastructure exactly the way you and I do, but with the constant inner knowledge that the infrastructure is not the ground. The ground is somewhere else. The pleuromic transmission is somewhere else, and the Gnostic has access. There is a specific phrase in the Gospel of Thomas that captures this exactly. Be passers-by. Jesus says to his disciples, be passers-by. 2 words. The standard reading is that this means, do not become attached to the world. The deeper Gnostic reading is that this is operational instruction. Move through the Watcher infrastructure as a passerby. Use it, participate in it, but do not stop and settle in it as if it were your home. You are passing through. Your home is elsewhere. The infrastructure is the corridor, not the destination. Be a passerby in the corridor. That is the instruction. Let me bring in the receipts now, because everything I have said is grounded in the texts, and you should see the texts speak for themselves. The Apocalypse of Adam is a Nag Hammadi text that nobody talks about as much as the more famous Gospels. It is short. It is a deathbed address from Adam to his son Seth. Adam is telling Seth the secret history. He is telling Seth what really happened. And in the course of that address, Adam describes the Watcher descent and the Watcher curriculum from a position that is unique in surviving literature. Adam was there. Adam saw it happen. Adam is reporting from the inside. The text describes how the Watchers identified there as the rulers and the powers descended to deceive humanity. It describes how their teaching was given in apparent generosity, but was actually a constriction. It describes how the original luminous knowledge that Adam and Eve carried, knowledge of the true God above the demiurge, was specifically targeted by the Watcher curriculum for suppression. The Watchers in this telling were not just installing technologies, they were erasing a prior transmission that humanity had received directly from Sophia. That is a critical detail. Before the Watchers came down, human beings already carried the Pomic transmission. They knew in some immediate way the upper realms. The Watcher curriculum was designed to overwrite that knowledge, to install a new operating system on top of an existing soul architecture. The 5 forbidden arts are the overwrite mechanism. Each one, in its own way, covers over a specific previous capacity that humanity once possessed. Metally covers over the previous capacity for non-coercive cooperation. Cosmetics covers over the previous capacity for face recognition between soul and soul. Astrology covers over the previous capacity to read time as fluid and pleuromic rather than fixed and planetary. Incantation covers over the previous capacity for direct address to the aeons without ritual mediation. Writing covers over the previous capacity for embodied, soul-to-soul memory transmission. The Watcher curriculum is a 5-point installation that targets 5 specific human capacities and replaces each one with a Watcher-compatible substitute. The Apocalypse of Adam closes by predicting that despite all of this, the original transmission will survive in a remnant, a small lineage, the pneumatic, those who carry the spark. The Watcher installation is total in scope, but partial in penetration. There are always some souls in whom the original transmission was not fully overwritten. Those souls are the Gnostic ancestors. Those souls are, if the lineage continues, the reality of the rulers, is another Nag Hammadi text. Also short, also undervalued by mainstream readers. This one focuses specifically on the Archon hierarchy and how they relate to humanity. It is sometimes called the hypostasis of the Archons, in alternate translations. The text confirms several key Watcher-related claims. It confirms that the Archons inherited a pre-existing apparatus. It confirms that humanity was constructed in stages, a body crafted by the demiurge and his subordinates, animated by a soul that contained a hidden, pleuromic spark that the constructors did not understand was inside their creation. The text shows that the Archons at various points attempt to extract or control the spark, and they fail because the spark belongs to a different operating system than the one they control. The reality of the rulers also gives us a specific detail that connects directly to the Watcher narrative. It describes a moment when the rulers approach the woman Eve in the textual reading with intent to defile her. This is described not as a sexual violence in the ordinary sense, but as an attempt to bind her soul spark to their operating system through physical contact. They fail because the spark withdraws into a higher form, leaving them with only the body. The text says they raped a shadow. The spark was elsewhere. What this gives us is the technical mechanism of how the pleuromic transmission survives even within the most aggressive Watcher Archon installation environment. The spark is not located in the body. The spark cannot be touched by physical or social means. The Watcher Archon apparatus operates on the substrate of body and society, and the spark operates on a different substrate entirely. The two never meet. The infrastructure is total in its domain, but its domain does not include the spark. The Book of the Watchers, which is the section of 1st Enoch that gives us most of the Watcher narrative, gives us chapters 7 and 8 as the key catalogue. Chapter 7 describes the descent and the wives and the Nephilim. Chapter 8 gives us the curriculum. Azil teaching weapons. Other Watchers teach enchantments, root cutting, herb cutting, astrology, the courses of the moon, and various signs. The list is longer in Enoch than the 5 I gave you, because Enoch breaks each art into subarts, but the structure is the same, a coordinated multi-domain installation of mediated technologies that together form an operating system. When you cross-reference Enoch's chapter 8 with the Apocalypse of Adam's account, you get a stereoscopic view of the same event. Enoch describes which was taught. The Apocalypse of Adam describes why it was taught and what it overwrote. Together, they form a complete picture, and the reality of the rulers shows you the layer above, the Archon administration that took over once the installation was complete. 3 texts, 1 reality, the prehistory of your imprisonment. There is one more textual detail worth surfacing here, because it appears in both the Enochian and Gnostic traditions in slightly different forms. The Watchers, after completing their installation, did not all return. Most of them were bound, chained in places of darkness, awaiting judgment according to Enoch, but a remnant remained loose. A subset of the original 200 continued to operate on Earth in subtler forms. They no longer take wives. They no longer father giants. They operate now through the institutions that descend from their original curriculum. They are still here in a sense. They are not gone. They are dispersed into the infrastructure they built. When the infrastructure operates, they operate. When you use a clock, somewhere in the operation of that clock, there is still a faint Watcher resonance. They are bound to their installations the way a maker is bound to his work. They cannot leave it. and so they remain scattered across the entire civilizational apparatus, embedded in every technology they introduced. Let me give you another receipt that does not get cited often. The Pistopia, in his longer passages on the descent of light into the lower realms, references beings who occupy a position structurally identical to the Watchers. Though the text uses different naming conventions, these beings in the Pist Sophia framing are described as having brought down a set of mysteries that humanity was not meant to receive, and as having sealed those mysteries with binding spells that made them difficult to unlearn. The mysteries in question, when you decode the Pist Sophia's symbolism map directly onto the 5 forbidden arts. Different language, same installation. The Pistophia is on this reading an independent confirmation of the Watcher operation from a Gnostic textual tradition that did not have direct contact with the Enochia materials. 2 streams, same memory. Strong evidence that the underlying event is historical, in the sense that both lineages preserved an authentic transmission. There is one more textual fragment I want to introduce, because it is small but precise. In the Apocryphon of John's long version, there is a passage that describes how certain angelic beings were dispatched by the chief ruler, Yao the Boath, to teach humanity arts that would bind them more firmly to the lower realms. The text names some of these beings, gives the specific functions they were assigned, and explicitly states that their work was done to prevent humans from remembering their Pyrrhomic origin. This passage is the closest the Gnostic corpus comes to a direct statement of the Watcher mission. Most translations gloss it as one of many ritual or cosmological listings, read with the Enoch materials open beside it. The passage reveals itself as a complementary account of the same event from a different witness perspective. So we have multiple witnesses: the Book of Enoch, the Apocalypse of Adam, the reality of the rulers, the Apocryphon of John, the Pisti Sophia, 5 distinct textual traditions preserving converging accounts of the pre-Archon installation of human civilization through a foreign agent class. The convergence across this many independent witnesses is itself an argument that something real is being described. This consistent myth does not arise by accident. The pattern is too specific. The technical claims are too coherent. The implications for practice are too aligned. Let me address one more dimension of this that frequently goes uncovered. The Watcher's installation included what we can call Sion-Dori delivery mechanisms. They did not just teach the original 5 arts to a few humans and walk away. They built structures into the curriculum that would propagate it across generations without further direct intervention. Each art was taught with tailing instructions embedded. The first mythologists were taught not just met-mythology, but how to teach metallology. The first astrologers were taught not just astrology, but how to apprentice future astrologers. The Watcher curriculum is recursive. It contains its own propagation mechanism. The installation is designed to spread without ongoing maintenance. This recursive design is why the curriculum survived the flood. Even if every Nephilim was wiped out, even if most of the original recipients were drowned, the surviving few carried the recursive teaching forward. The installation could be rebooted from a small remnant. The flood was a partial scrub, but it could not erase the curriculum because the curriculum had been designed to survive precisely this kind of catastrophic disruption. By the time the demiurgic harvest system was ready to take over, the curriculum had repropagated, and humanity was once again ready for full domestication. The same recursive design is why every attempt across history to abolish parts of the curriculum has failed. People have tried. There have been anti-iteracy movements, anti-cosmetic movements, anti-astrological movements, anti-weapon movements. Each one targets a specific installation. None of them have succeeded for long, because the curriculum is mutually reinforcing. Destroy one art, and the other 4 create conditions that regenerate it. You cannot uninstall the curriculum piece by piece. You can only step outside its operating substrate entirely, which is what Gnostic practice teaches. This is also why political revolution has historically been a failed Gnostic strategy. Revolutionaries have often started with genuine recognition of the Watcher infrastructure. They see the kings, the priests, the laws, the markets, and they see correctly that all of this is installed oppression. They then attempt to overthrow it. The overthrow uses Watcher syntax tools, organized violence, ideological proclamations, hierarchical movements, sealed loyalty oaths. The new system that emerges from the revolution is structurally identical to the system it's to replaced, because it was built using the same toolkit. The Watcher infrastructure absorbs every revolution and reissues itself in slightly altered form. Marx replaces the king. The party replaces the church. The 5-year plan replaces the calendar. The infrastructure is invariant, only its labels change. The Gnostic exit was never political. The Gnostic exit was always individual and substantive. It does not require overthrowing anything. It requires recognizing what is. The infrastructure remains. The Gnostic exits while the infrastructure continues to run. This was a hard one. Insight in the Gnostic lineage, gained partly through observing the failure of various early revolutionary impulses that arose within Gnostic communities. The texts that survived are mature texts. They have already concluded that revolution does not work. They prescribe recognition instead. Now I want to turn this in a direction that most viewers will not expect, because so far we have been talking about the Watchers as external beings who did something to humanity. That is the standard frame. It is correct as far as it goes. But there is a deeper Gnostic layer that needs to be added. Now, the Watcher operation did not just install external technologies. It also installed internal operating patterns. Each of the 5 forbidden arts as an internal correlation inside the human soul. The Watchers did not just teach metally, externally. They installed an in-metallology, a way for the soul to relate to its own contents, as if those contents were tools to be wielded coercively. They did not just teach external cosmetics. They installed an inner cosmetic apparatus, a way for the soul to present false versions of itself to itself. When you find yourself in the privacy of your own mind, forcing one part of yourself to obey another part, that is the inner metally, the technology of internal coercion that mirrors the external technology of hierarchy. When you find yourself in your own self-image, presenting a face to yourself that you know is not your true face, that is the inner cosmetic. When you find yourself fatalistically reading your own past, as if your fate were sealed by your circumstances, that is the inner astrology. When you find yourself using formal mental incantations to manage your own states, repeating affirmations as if the words themselves had power, performing inner rituals of self-management, that is inner incantation. When you find yourself relying on written notes to remember who you are, when you cannot hold your own identity without the props of journals and lists and stored memories, that is the inner writing. The Watcher installation goes all the way down. It is not just out there in civilization, it is in your own self-relationship. The way you treat yourself is in the Gnostic reading, often a reproduction of how the Watchers train humanity to treat each other and to treat themselves. The inner prison mirrors the outer prison, because the same operating system runs both. This is why Gnostic interior practice is so much more demanding than ordinary religious practice. Ordinary practice operates on the assumption that the inner life of the practitioner is fundamentally sound, and only the outer behavior needs adjustment. Gnostic practice operates on the assumption that the inner life is itself a Watcher condition, construction, and must be re-inspected from the ground up. Every inner movement is suspect until verified. Every self-narrative is potentially an installed program until tested against the pleuromic transmission. Every habitual self-treatment is potentially an inner Watcher technology operating without your knowledge. It is also why Gnostic practitioners across the centuries have spoken of long periods of disorientation when they first begin serious inner inspection. Because as the inner Watcher technologies become visible, the practitioner can no longer rely on his own habitual self-relationship as a stable ground. He has to find a new ground, and the new ground is of course the pleuromic transmission, the parallel substrate that runs underneath the Watcher operating system. But you cannot rest on that new ground until you have built the perceptual capacity to make contact with it. And building that capacity is what Gnostic practice is. Silence recognition prayer, the breath spark activation, the naming of the aeons, the bridal chamber, the refusal of ritualized prayer. These are not random spiritual hobbies. They are precisely calibrated tools for stepping out of the Watcher operating system, contacting the pleiomic transmission, and gradually building enough familiarity with the 30 parallel substrate that you can stand on it. A Gnostic, in the technical sense, is a being who has stood on the parallel substrate enough times that the Watcher operating system no longer commands all of his attention. The infrastructure is still there. The Watcher installations are still running, but the Gnostic has another reference point, and that reference point is permanent. The recognition cannot be undone. Once a soul has made contact with the pleiomic transmission, it remembers, and the remembering cannot be erased, even by death. This is why the Gnostics speak of the spark as a fragment of the pleioma itself, rather than as a gift from the pleioma. The spark is a pleiomic substance. To recognize it is to recognize that a piece of the pleioma is already and always was inside the prison. The Watchers could not interfere with the spark. The Archons cannot extract the spark. The Demiurge cannot even sever the spark, because his perceptual apparatus does not run on pleiomic substrate. The entire harvest system is built around the energy that the spark generates inside the human soul. But the spark itself is invisible to the harvesters. They consume the byproducts. The center remains untouched. This is the deepest implication of the Watcher prehistory. The Watchers built the prison. They were very good at it. The infrastructure is real, total, all-encompassing. But the infrastructure was built around something that the builders could not perceive. The prison contains a center that the architects never saw, and that center is yours. This is why the Gnostics, when they finally reached the end of their analysis, did not despair. They saw the prison clearly. They named the architects. They catalogued the installations. They mapped the harvest system. And then they laughed in their own quiet way, because they had seen the punchline. The whole apparatus was built around a substrate the builders could not access. The whole operation is, in a sense, a magnificent feat of engineering, with one fatal flaw. Its operators do not know what is at its center. You are at its center. The pleiomic spark in you is at its center. The Watcher infrastructure surrounds it on every side, but the infrastructure does not penetrate the center. You can be touched on every side, and your center remains untouched. You can be conditioned, propagandized, surveilled, exploited, harvested for luch, and your center remains untouched. The infrastructure is total in its scope, but does not extend to the substrate of the spark. The Gnostic discovery is not that the prison can be broken. The Gnostic discovery is that the prison was never able to reach the prisoner. The prisoner is somewhere the prison cannot go. The Watchers built around the prisoner, but they could not build into the prisoner. The discovery is structural, not heroic. It is a recognition of a fact about geometry, not a victory in a war. Once you have that recognition, the war stops mattering in the way it used to. You stop trying to defeat the Watchers. You stop trying to expose the Archons. You stop trying to overthrow the Demiurge. The whole confrontational framing falls away. Not because those beings are good, or because their operation is harmless. They are not, and it is not. But because confrontation is itself a Watcher syntax operation. The Watchers taught humans to fight. The fight is the installation. To enter into fight mode with the Watchers is to use their own operating system to oppose them, which means you remain inside their operating system, which means they win, even if you appear to win. The Gnostic exit is not a fight. The Gnostic exit is a recognition that produces as its natural consequence a dice engagement. The Gnostic stops feeding the system, not by attacking it, but by no longer believing in it as the ground. The system continues to run, but it no longer runs through the Gnostic the way it runs through unawakened humans. The energy stops flowing. This is the only kind of victory the pleioma actually wants. The pleioma does not want to triumph over the Watchers, because triumph is a Watcher concept. The pleioma wants recognition. The pleioma wants its scattered sparks to remember themselves and to come home. The infrastructure can keep running. The eons do not care. The infrastructure is irrelevant. The moment the sparks recognize themselves, the system only matters because it conceals the sparks from each other. Once the sparks recognize each other, the concealment fails, and the system loses its function. The watcher technologies you use every day will continue to be there. You will continue to use them. The clock will still tell time. The mirror will still show your face. The book will still hold the words. The pill will still affect your body. The weapon, if you ever use one, will still kill. None of this changes. What changes is your relationship to all of it. A Gnostic uses a clock without believing the time is what the clock displays. A Gnostic looks in a mirror without believing that the face is what is reflected. A Gnostic reads a book without believing that knowledge is what is written. Agnostic takes a pill without believing that healing is what the pill provides. A Gnostic moves through every watcher installation with a constant low-level awareness that the installation is real but is not the ground. A constant awareness is the only thing the watchers could not install. They installed everything else. They could not install the awareness of the installation. That awareness, once a soul has it, is the disengagement. The infrastructure remains. The use of the infrastructure continues, but the soul is no longer captured by what it uses. This is the discernment that the Gnostic carries through every moment of life in the watcher. Infrastructure. Discernment is the technical word. The Gnostic discerns constantly which part of his life is watcher installed and which part is pleiomic substrate. The discernment is not paranoid. The Gnostic is not in a constant state of alarm. The discernment is just clarity, just seeing, just knowing what is what. And the discernment grows over time. The longer a Gnostic practices, the more finely calibrated the discernment becomes. At first, only the most obvious installations are visible. The formal religious rituals, the political propaganda, the consumer manipulation. Then the middle layer becomes visible. The social conventions, the language games, the time pressures. Then the deep layer becomes visible. The inner watcher technologies, the self-coercive patterns, the inner cosmetic apparatus, the inner astrology of one's own life narrative. Each layer that becomes visible is a layer that can be selectively disengaged from. Each disengagement is a recovery of energy that was previously flowing into the system. Over years, decades, the cumulative effect is significant. The Gnostic ends up holding back enormous amounts of energy that the system had been harvesting from him. That energy returns to its source, to the spark. The spark grows brighter. The pleiomic transmission becomes more accessible. The recognition deepens. By the time the Gnostic approaches death, the spark is operating at a level that the threshold Archons cannot effectively challenge. The exit is technically achievable, not because the Gnostic learned a magical password, but because the Gnostic spent years recovering energy from the watcher infrastructure and feeding it back into the spark. The death protocol that other Gnostic teachings emphasize, the 3 words at death, the refusal of the tunnel light, the answers to the 3 Archon questions, those are real and important, but they only function for a soul that has been recovering its energy throughout life. A soul that has been bleeding energy into the watcher infrastructure until the last moment will not have the spark strength to execute the death protocol successfully. The protocol works because the energy is there to power it. The energy is there because of years of discernment-based disengagement. The discernment-based disengagement is possible because of the prior recognition. The prior recognition is what this video has been working toward. There is a specific exercise I want to give you now, because all of this remains theoretical until it becomes operational in your own life. The exercise is simple. It will take you less than 10 minutes per day. It will, over the course of a few months, begin to shift your relationship to the watcher infrastructure in measurable ways. The exercise has 3 steps. Step 1. At some quiet moment each day, early morning works best, but any consistent moment will serve. Pick 3 small things from your immediate experience: a belief you hold, a habit you practice, an emotional reaction you have. Just 3. Pick whatever surfaces first when you ask yourself the question. Do not strain. The first 3 are the right 3. Step 2. For each of the 3, ask the discernment question. Who installed this and when? And does it carry the pleuromic transmission or the watcher signal? Do not try to answer immediately. Hold the question in attention. Let the answer come on its own. Often the answer arrives not in words, but in a kind of recognition. You simply see with sudden clarity the source of the installation. Other times the answer takes hours or days to surface. That is fine. The question is the operation. The answer follows on its own schedule. Step 3. Once you have a sense of the source for each of the 3 items, do not yet try to change them. Just notice. Just hold the seeing. The change, if change is appropriate, will arise on its own from the seeing. Most installations dissolve simply by being seen clearly. They do not require effortful uprooting. They were holding because they were invisible. Once visible, they lose their automatic operation. The seeing is the disengagement. Do this for 3 months. 3 things per day. By the end of 3 months, you will have inspected over 200 items in your own operating system. Many will turn out to be watcher installations of various kinds. Some will turn out to be pleuromic substrates that do not need any change. Some will turn out to be hybrid, partly installed, partly authentic, requiring further inspection. The point is not to produce a verdict on each item. The point is to develop the capacity for discernment itself. The capacity is the thing. The capacity, once developed, applies automatically to everything you encounter for the rest of your life. Most spiritual practices give you techniques. This is not a technique. This is the installation of a capacity. The capacity to see your own operating system as it runs. Once installed, the capacity does not have to be reapplied each time. It simply runs in the background, and your perception of your own life changes accordingly. The watcher infrastructure becomes increasingly transparent. The pleiomic substrate becomes increasingly available. The two become distinguishable in real time. This is what the Gnostics did. This is what the surviving texts teach when read as operational instruction rather than as theological doctrine. The Apocryphon of John, read this way, is not a creation myth. It is a description of the operating system the reader is currently embedded in. The Gospel of Truth is not poetic theology. It is a recognition trigger document. The tripartite tractate is not philosophical speculation. It is a technical manual for moving from watcher-substrate operation to pleuromic substrate operation. The texts are instruments. They were always instruments. The watcher infrastructure tries to convert them into mere historical artifacts, mere objects of scholarly study. That conversion is itself a watcher operation. The texts must be encountered as operational documents to do their work. Before you sleep, run the discernment question on 3 things. 3 small things. A habit you have, a phrase you say to yourself, an emotional pattern that activates without your consent. For each one, ask who installed this and when. And does it carry the pleuromic transmission or the watcher's signal? Do not try to change anything yet. Just see. Just discern. The seeing is the disengagement. The disengagement is the recovery of energy. The recovery of energy is the growth of the spark. The growth of the spark is the approach to the exit. And the exit, when it comes, will not feel like a fight or a triumph. It will feel, as the Gnostics described it, like remembering something you had always known. There is one more thing to say, and then we are done. The Watchers, despite everything, were not the originators of evil. They were instruments. The Demiurge himself was an instrument. The whole apparatus from the highest Archon down to the smallest installed habit exists, because Sophia's first emanation produced a possibility space, the required exploration. The Gnostic teaching is unflinching about this. None of what is happening is outside the pleuromic permission. The prison itself, with all its cruelty and all its sophistication, is part of how the pleioma comes to know what it is by experiencing what it is not. The Watchers were sent. They were not in rebellion. They were doing exactly what they were directed to do. The Demiurge was, in his ignorance, performing his function. Even the harvest system, brutal as it is, serves a function that the pleroma allows, because the pleroma is patient on a scale we cannot comprehend. This does not make the harvest acceptable. It does not make the prison palatable. It does not invalidate your wish to exit, but it does change the emotional tone of the exit. You are not escaping a tyranny that should not exist. You are graduating from an apparatus whose function for you is complete. Graduation is not a victory over enemies. It is the natural conclusion of a process that has worked itself through. There is one final layer worth touching, because it ties the entire transmission together. Across every Gnostic text that addresses the Watcher operation, there is a quiet consistency about what the Watchers could not do. They could not extinguish the spark. They could not falsify the recognition event. They could not enter the bridal chamber. They could not produce a pluromic name. They could not author silence. Each of these is a capacity that in the Gnostic taxonomy belongs exclusively to beings whose substrate is pluromic. The Watchers, despite their power over the mediated substrate of civilization, were locked out of these specific capacities by the structural geometry of their own being. They simply did not have the substrate to perform any of these acts. This locked-out catalogue is in effect the Gnostic map of the exits. Every door the Watchers could not pass through is a door you can pass through. The spark they cannot extinguish is your home base. The recognition event they cannot fake is your verification tool. The bridal chamber they cannot enter is your sanctuary. The pluromic name they cannot produce is your password. The silence they cannot author is your operational medium. 5 capacities, 5 exits. Each one corresponds, by an inverse symmetry, to one of the 5 forbidden arts. They installed 5 arts to lock you in. The Pleleoma left you 5 capacities to step out. The geometry is exact. Metallurgy locked you into hierarchy. The recognition event unlocks you from it. Once you have recognized the spark, no hierarchy can hold the recognition. Cosmetics locked you into masked perception. The pluromic name unlocks you. Once the soul has spoken its true name to itself, no mask convinces it again. Astrology locks you into false determinism. The bridal chamber unlocks you. Once the soul has met its higher counterpart, no horoscope can dictate its course. Incantation locks you into an Archon syntax address. Silence unlocks you. Silence is the one address mode the Watcher-installed syntax cannot occupy. Writing locked you into external memory. The spark itself unlocks you. The spark holds its own pre-birth memory, and contact with the spark restores access to it, without the need for any external storage at all. This 5 against 5 symmetry is in the Gnostic understanding not accidental. It was built in. The Pleoma did not leave its scattered sparks defenseless in the prison. It provided in advance exactly the capacities required to step out of each specific installation the Watchers were going to introduce. The provision predates the prison. The exit was prepared before the cage was built. This is part of why the Gnostic, on finally seeing the structure, does not panic. The structure includes its own escape. The escape was always there. It only had to be recognized. The Watchers built the prison. The Archons run it. The Demiurge thinks he is god of it. But none of them ever owned the center. The center was always pluromic. The center is still pluromic. The center is you. Ask the question. Carry the question. Let it work on every assumption you hold. Begin tonight. Not everything you were taught is yours.